Okay. I have the honor and the pleasure of inviting Dr. Yanai from Haifa University to talk about Israel and the Middle East today. Dr. Yanai is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Israeli Studies at Haifa University. He is a member of two important bodies in Israel: the Israeli Universities Study Group and a member of the Foreign Ministers Advisory Board on Overseas Information. He received his PhD from Columbia University. Prior to his academic career, he held several positions in journalism and in the government. He wrote several books about Israeli politics. The last one, which is forthcoming very shortly, deals with party leadership in Israel. And if you are interested, you can find it. It will appear in volume 13 of the Modern Middle East series by Columbia University. Okay. That's it. I am grateful to Dr. Yanai because he has a sore throat and he half sick. So we appreciate his appearance here, and I'm sure he will have a very interesting talk. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weissman, and I'm very glad to be here. I just hope that you can hear my voice. Actually, it's better than I thought.
I think the other one doesn't work.
Okay, that's fine, yeah.
Oh.
Okay, I'll speak about new realities in the Middle East. First, I'd like to offer an overview, and later to touch on certain events, major events that took place in the last 2 or 3 years. Indeed, it is possible to identify 5 areas of conflict that historically shaped the political structure and determined the course of events in the Middle East. The first one being the superpower rivalry, the second one, the Arab-Islamic quest for a larger regional and world roles and political independence. The third one, the divisions within the Arab world. And the fourth one, the Arab-Israeli conflict. The fifth one, of course, has to do with the fact that this region is blessed, as you know, with oil resources. Now, each one of these interrelated areas of conflict produced in the last decade or the last 2 or 3 years a major, far-reaching event. The superpower rivalry, the Afghani affair, the Russian invasion to Afghanistan. Actually, I use the word produced, but perhaps we should say we must understand these events in the context, in the framework of this conflict. Okay, so we have the Afghani affair. We have the second area of conflict, the Arab-Islamic quest for larger roles, produced the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Divisions within the Arab world are numerous. You know that the Arab world is divided several ways. Today it is divided, or within this Arab world we can recognize the rejectionist front, the state fastness camp that includes Iraq, Syria, Libya, Algeria, South Yemen, the PLO. We have Egypt, the leading Arab country that is now isolated because of the Egypt-Israeli treaty, isolated formally, though it is still the leading Arab country with many ties in the Arab world. But I mentioned the rejectionist front in order to underscore my point. Even within the rejectionist front, we have many conflicts. We have the conflict between Syria and Iraq, the two branches of the Ba'ath Party. We have the conflict between the recent conflict between Libya and the PLO. And just to mention several, even armed conflicts between Egypt and Libya, between Algeria and Tunisia, between Algeria and Morocco. Now, I don't have to dwell. No, perhaps I'll mention it too. The Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, produced the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. And the oil resources, of course, turned the Middle East into a major area or turned the Middle East into a major concern of the industrial world and of the superpowers. Now, before relating to at least two of these events, the Afghani affair and the Egypt-Israeli peace treaty, let me offer an historical observation, in other words, observation relating to the position of the West in the Middle East. At the end of the Second World War, the West controlled the Middle East. The West was even successful to close this area, to fence it, and to control the border zone with the Soviet Union. I refer to events in Turkey, even in Iran. The Shah, the deposed Shah, was able to push back the Russians that controlled several areas in Iran, Azerbaijan, Balochistan, of course with the aid of the West. Later on, in 1955, the West established the Baghdad Pact, which later, afterwards, became part of CENTO. However, the West failed to establish a durable security system in the area, thus failing to prevent Russian penetration into the area. Several reasons contributed to it, and let me just mention them in passing. The first one was the anti-Western and anti-colonial sentiment in the Arab world. At the end of the Second World War, several of the Arab states were still under one form or another of colonial rule. Egypt, if we take Egypt, the leading Arab country, actually completed this process of decolonization only in 1956 at the failure of the Suez campaign, only in 1956. Therefore, it's quite understood that they didn't share the concern of the West vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, and weren't anxious, as Western Europe was, to cooperate with the United States in the formation of a regional security organization. The second reason was the disunity of the West. The French were suspicious of the British. The British were suspicious of the Americans. And the Americans didn't have a clear policy, facing a dilemma. On the one hand, the United States wanted to hasten the process of decolonization in order to prevent Russian penetration into the area. On the other hand, of course, the colonial powers were its best allies, Great Britain and France. And actually the United States didn't have a clear policy until after the Suez Campaign. In the Suez Campaign, it humiliated France and Great Britain. And this was a turning point. Since then, the United States became the major Western power in the area. Becoming the major power in the area, it had to face, especially the Nasserist attempt, or the attempt by Egypt under the presidency of Nasser, to unify the Arab world under its leadership by agitation, even by subversion and force. And and the United States was forced even to send Air Force units to Saudi in order to prevent the expansion of the Yemenite war. In other words, the transfer of this war to Saudi Arabia. In 1958, the United States sent Marines to Lebanon to prevent a radical Islamic takeover of this country. Afterwards, the British sent troops to Jordan for the same purpose, to prevent a radical coup, a radical takeover of Jordan. The third reason was the Russian policy. The Soviet Union adopted very flexible, very pragmatic, opportunistic policies in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, it was the first power to turn the sale of arms into a major instrument of policy. They didn't ask any questions. They didn't, without no strings attached, they provided Egypt with weapons, modern weapons, while the leaders of the Egyptian Communist Party rot in jail. And after Egypt, they provided weapons actually to any Arab, Islamic, Middle Eastern country that asked for it. The fourth reason is, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict that increased the demand for this hardware, for weapons. And the Soviet Union, being prepared to provide it, of course, benefited from it. Now, I think that actually until Afghanistan, the West was successful, despite certain gains made by the Soviet Union. The West was successful in at least closing the area, controlling the border zone, and in guaranteeing, securing the flow of oil to the industrial West. The invasion to Afghanistan was a turning point because not because Afghanistan is so important. Of course it is important. And from Afghanistan, you can direct, you can reach out you get closer to the Persian Gulf, no question about it. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union actually acquired a foothold in Afghanistan 2 years ago, about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, after the initial pro-Soviet coup. At that time, the coup by itself didn't create a strong reaction in the West. The United States and its allies actually acquiesced. It wasn't such a major dramatic event. However, what happened now in Afghanistan, the invasion, the use of direct force outside the recognized, established sphere of influence of the Soviet Union turned Afghanistan into a major global focal point, because it was the first time that the Soviet Union broke the superpower rules of the game, using direct force, as I have mentioned, outside the recognized, established sphere of influence. So beforehand, there was Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, but there was no Afghanistan. In other words, there was no direct use of force outside the established sphere of influence. And there is, of course, a question, why did they do it? I mean, in my opinion, I'm not so sure about it, but nevertheless, let me bring it to you. I think that they probably made or committed here their worst mistake since the Second World War in Afghanistan. It was an excessive use of force, because they already gained a position of influence in Afghanistan beforehand. And using direct force, breaking these rules of the game, they created a strong reaction in the West that perhaps they didn't anticipate. I don't have to elaborate on the reaction in the West. You're acquainted with it. And you know, even this threat or the cancellation of the American participation in the Olympic Games hurt the Soviet Union. Every totalitarian regime prides itself in events like this, and it doesn't take it lightly. But of course it goes beyond that. Until Afghanistan, the United States didn't agree to provide China with military infrastructure. Now it changed this policy. Beforehand, the United States didn't encourage Japan to rearm. Japan spending only 1% of the gross national product for defense, and now the United States did encourage Japan. And when you look at it from the Russian point of view, you look at the map with Russian eyes, suddenly Angola and South Yemen are not that important. And you see that perhaps they have a good reason to fear encirclement. On the West, you still have an unshaky NATO. They weren't successful to shake the unity of NATO, despite the fact that they have strong communist parties in Italy and France. On the East, the first time, you have United States, China, and Japan in one corner. And the defection of China from the East to the West is certainly the most important event in the last decade in world history. So perhaps the Soviet Union was actually reacting in Afghanistan to a situation or to a certain anticipation concerning the situation in Iran. Perhaps they were anticipating an American military action in Iran, and they wanted to prepare their own part, or they wanted to use this opportunity in order to take over part of Iran. And we always find that the Soviet Union is anxious to deal directly with the United States, to try to divide the sphere of influence. even concerning the Arab-Israeli conflict. They always appeal to the United States, let's make an agreement, and then impose it on our client states. This is their official approach. And perhaps they have prepared an invasion to Iran and not to Afghanistan, and then overreacted in Afghanistan to a lingering local problem, to a situation that failed to materialize in Iran. But this is just a speculation. Nevertheless, it may bring us, this explanation may bring us closer to the Middle East proper. Because the reaction in the West to the Afghani affair gave birth to another crisis in the Middle East, to the new Lebanese crisis. Of course, when you want to lower the profile of one crisis, you start another in order to divert attention. And that's actually what the Soviet Union has been doing. Several days after the visit of Foreign Minister Gromyko in Beirut, the government of Syria announced its decision to pull out its troops from certain positions in Lebanon. Now, what does it mean? It meant that the various camps in Lebanon will again be able, let me put it first in neutral terms, be able to start the civil strife in Lebanon. Because the Syrian troops separated between these camps, especially in Beirut. So this was a kind of an invitation for the resumption of the civil strife, for the resumption of the Lebanese crisis. So one crisis has led to another. Now let me perhaps skip several comments because I see the time is running fast and move to the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. The peace treaty is being implemented fully without any appreciable crisis. Last week there was an exchange of ambassadors between Israel and Egypt. However, Egypt is beginning to express its residual hostility or its remaining ambivalent attitude towards Israel. Not by official spokesmen, by official spokesmen, not by President Sadat. I refer especially to an interview given by the Deputy Prime Minister for Islamic Affairs, Hassan al-Tuhami, that in an interview to a newspaper in Kuwait predicted the coming end of the so-called State of Israel. Of course, such predictions don't go very well in Israel. And there were other expressions of hostility towards Israel. And again, I may add right away, it's almost understood. What happened in Egypt is that the past moderates became the present radicals. Because many academicians, intellectuals that indeed were moderates prior to the initiative, to the Sadat's initiative and visit to Jerusalem, were left behind and found it harder to adjust to the new dramatic departure. And some of them are the radicals of today. They are not exactly part of the rejectionist front and its ideological approach, but they somewhat behind Sadat and the leadership that pursued the peace negotiations with Israel. It is not. It is quite characteristic that and important that Hassan al-Tuhami is in charge of Islamic affairs, because Egypt wants to balance somewhat, or to begin to balance its attitude in order to reopen bridges to the Arab world and to gain new recognition. As you know, the Camp David Agreement includes two parts. One, a draft peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The second one is a framework for a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. The second part is still being negotiated between Egypt, Israel, and the United States concerning the implementation of an autonomy plan to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There were already several rounds of negotiations. They didn't produce any agreement yet. In my opinion, before trying to call your attention to the dividing issues, I have a certain doubt whether, and of course I express my own personal view or assessment, I have a doubt whether Egypt would want to become a signatory to a second agreement with Israel on their autonomy, in other words, relating to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, when the Palestinians themselves and Jordan refused to join the process of negotiation. I mean, they did their share. They ascertained autonomy, which isn't exactly what they want. They would like to have a state. Perhaps they would like to have, not perhaps, this is their own record on it, they would like to have a state instead of Israel. But still, autonomy is certainly a meaningful step towards self-determination, and it provides the inhabitants with independence in running their own civilian affairs. So it could be that Egypt is deliberating or considering the possibility of not signing another agreement with Israel on the autonomy in the absence of the representatives of the Palestinians. Some of them, by the way, wanted to participate in the talks. There were more than rumors about it, but then the PLO waged a campaign of terror in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and these people backed down. The last victim of this campaign terror was the highest religious authority, Islamic religious authority in the Gaza Strip, that was killed because he was close they suspected him to be close to the Egyptian position. And now the dividing issues in these rounds of negotiations relate to the questions of the powers of the autonomy. What will be the powers of the autonomy? And of course, the autonomy is a transitional solution, 5 years solution. It isn't the permanent political structure for this area. And that's what made an agreement possible between the two opposing sides. Egypt actually acquiesced to the Israeli demand not to establish a Palestinian state at the present time. Israel gave up any intention to annex the area or to continue its military government in the area. Now, so this is the first major dividing issues is the powers of the autonomy. The second one relates to Jerusalem. Is East Jerusalem going to be part of the autonomy, and in what way, or not? The third one is, of course, the redeployment of Israeli forces. Israel has to redeploy its forces. Where is it going to deploy the forces, etc., and other relating issues? Let me just say this. I am not that pessimistic. I believe that it is definitely possible to reach an agreement. And I believe that it is definitely possible to implement this agreement. Because there is no doubt in my mind that the local population will cooperate in the implementation. I don't believe that they will go on record supporting the autonomy. No. If you go to visit Israel, you can see almost every day on Israeli television. You don't have to hear about it here. Or on Israeli radio, you can hear statements by mayors from the West Bank, other notables and community leaders expressing their views in support of a Palestinian state, opposing the autonomy. I don't expect any and don't anticipate any dramatic change in this regard. However, if the Israeli government and the Egyptian government and the American government will come over to these people and tell them, all right, from today, beginning today, you are capable of running your own affairs. Would they refuse? I believe that they wouldn't refuse. They will cooperate in the practical arrangements, while perhaps continuing their objection, their overall objection, or their political objection to the autonomy plan. There is, of course, another option. If these talks fail, Israel will be able, or will consider the unilateral implementation of the autonomy plan. I believe that Sadat once said, we are trying to force them to be free. In other words, they don't come. We invited them to the negotiations. They didn't agree. Terminating the military government because of a very good reason. Israel is aware of the damaging impact of this prolonged military government over civilian population. Who remembers? And if they do, it doesn't make any difference, that Israel occupied these areas in a defensive war in '67, not by design. Who remembers that Israel, following this war, offered to negotiate? In response, the Arab states gathering in, or represent the leaders of the Arab states, gathered in Rabat later on and decided no negotiation, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. In Israel was left with these territories. No one wanted even to negotiate the return of these territories. And the government of Israel even decided at that time, now it's well known, it's well documented, decided immediately after the war to return the entire peninsula, Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights for peace, While as far as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are concerned, there were other notions that didn't include a military government in the area. Now, why Israel is so sensitive in this regard? Why the West Bank is so crucial to Israel's security? I think if we had a map here, or if you visited the area, you'd understand. The distance between the West Bank and the seashore runs between 6.5 and 15 miles. That's all. I just heard, I think the day before yesterday, Senator Kennedy mentioning the fact that Cuba is 60 miles off the shores of the United States. 60 miles, Cuba versus near the United States. Here we are talking about 6.5 miles, up to 15 miles. In other words, whoever controls the West Bank controls the entire airspace of Israel. He can even use light weapons to hit the centers of population in Israel. In other words, some military control over the West Bank is absolutely mandatory for the defense of Israel, especially as long as there is still a rejectionist front on the east facing Israel. And therefore, Israel is so concerned about the West Bank, and that's one of the reasons why Israel is determined to maintain its military positions in these areas. President Sadat and Egypt recognized, and the United States recognized in Camp David, Israel's problem of security in these areas. And actually, the Camp David Agreement has two foundations. One, calling for autonomy to the civilian population. Second, recognizing the legitimacy of the Israeli military presence without specifying in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, let me move from here to another issue that is in the news. You hear about it every day, the settlement issue. The settlement issue actually is twofold. There is a national consensus in Israel concerning settlements for security reasons. Settlements being part of Israel's traditional concept of security. It is a small people, a small country, a very small standing army, relying heavily on reserve units. Therefore, Israel relied heavily on settlements, border settlements, for its defense. It enabled Israel, of course, to stop an invader, to close the border, until it can mobilize its entire military force. These settlements provide or make actually security zones together with military installations in the West Bank, Golan Heights, other places. These settlements were built, most of them, under previous governments that were led by the Labour Party that today is in opposition since May 1977. the first turnover in Israeli government. However, there is an intense political debate within Israel concerning other settlements, not for strict security reasons, which are based on the assumption or the claim, demand, that Jews should have the right to settle in the land of Israel. That a Jewish government cannot turn part of this biblical land into a Judenrein territory. In other words, an area, a territory, the Jews cannot or are not allowed to settle. Of course, provided they do not settle on private land without the owner's consent. This government, now, we must distinguish between, of course, these two types of settlements. While there is a consensus, and while the overwhelming majority of the settlements were built for this purpose, according to a plan, a pre-designed plan, there were several settlements that were built recently, not entirely, not without regard, but not entirely on the basis of an overall security plan. One of these settlements was even evacuated, was removed by decision of the Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court. In other words, the civilians, the landowners, were able to appeal to Israel's Supreme Court and to get help. The Supreme Court ordered the government to evacuate this settlement, Elon Moreh, and the government complied, adopting the principle that the settlement shouldn't be built on private land, only on empty land or on, of course, on land that was purchased, was bought properly from its legal owners. However, again, there are these two attitudes. The first one is the traditional Israeli attitude. It is responsible for the establishment of most settlements. But there were several settlements that were built in response to the claim that Jews should be allowed to build settlements or to settle in the biblical land on empty land. Now I'll leave it, I just wanted to present these two views. The first one is the traditional one. It has the backing of the overwhelming majority of Israelis. It is part of the national consensus. The second one has the support of one segment of the Israeli society. It doesn't contradict, in most cases, with the concept of security. However, they do claim, even when they establish a settlement for security reasons, they still maintain that Jews should be allowed to settle in the biblical land regardless of the security needs. This is an intense political issue, a debate in Israel. As you know, when you have adversary politics, when you have a democratic regime, the various parties and political leaders sometimes, in most cases, exaggerate, overstate their case in order to get across. And what is happening sometimes, that Israel projects this debate, but doesn't project the consensus, the national consensus concerning the settlements. And this is a small price to pay for being a democracy. Since there is communication between the Israeli society and the American society. Sometimes it is only the debate, it is only the dividing issue that is being transferred and being followed, and not the fact that there is a national consensus on the settlement issue concerning security settlement. Now, let me just draw one parallel, or at least the possibility of a parallel. I mentioned Cuba before. The United States has a huge base in Cuba, Guantanamo, for security reasons. As far as I know, the Cuban government didn't give its consent to it. Nevertheless, United States, being a superpower, felt that it should have a base in Cuba, and for a very good reason. The Soviet Union, and at the end of the Second World War, changed the border on the east, created the Oder-Neisse border. West Germany even acquiesced, even recognized this border at a later date. Several cities, German cities, were just disappeared. Even the name was changed. Now, Israel didn't choose to try to change the composition, the structure of the West Bank, nor to build Guantanamos, because it is a small nation. It has a different concept of security. It has a different military structure. It has a civilized army to a large degree, relying heavily on border settlements. So I hope that you understand better at least the Israeli position on it, or some of the facts in this regard. Must be. Shall I proceed, or shall I? Okay. Okay. Now, as for the position of Jordan, let me make one comment. I mentioned before that Jordan and the Palestinians refused until now to join the talks. The Palestinians, and when we talk about the Palestinians, there are Palestinians. There are also Jewish Palestinians. Palestine is the former mandatory regime, British mandatory regime. We have to distinguish between the Palestinian community in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, about 1 million people, an equal number in Jordan, Jordan being part of the mandatory Palestine. Actually, Jordan was established by Great Britain only as Transjordan, only in 1921. Only in 1921, Great Britain decided to separate the East Bank of Palestine from the West Bank of Palestine. The West Bank is one unit, not the West Bank that we were talking about before, and to establish Transjordan. They have brought a prince from the Arab Peninsula, from Hejaz, Hussein's grandfather, Emir Abdallah, who became afterwards the king, who started the Hashemic kingdom of Jordan. So, and in this kingdom, the Palestinians, well, this kingdom being in Palestine actually, and in this kingdom today, the majority of the population are Palestinians from the West Bank, originating in the West Bank. About 1 million plus people. 4 of them served as prime ministers in Jordan. Many of them are members of the professions, academy, civil service, and in recent years, the military forces. Now, the PLO is recognized, as you know, by the Arab world and by many other countries as the sole representative of the Palestinians. However, its leadership is in direct command of the Palestinian community only in Lebanon, mostly in Lebanon, where you still have about close to 300,000 in refugee camps. The Palestinians in Jordan are Jordanians. They have Jordanian citizenship. They participate in the political life, in the economic life of Jordan. The Palestinians on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip elected their own leaders in democratic elections. By the way, Israel didn't abolish the Jordanian law in the West Bank. And in West Bank, Gaza Strip was controlled for many years by Egypt, not by Jordan. Egypt controlled it and maintained it in a stateless position with a nightly curfew, while Jordan, invading this part of Palestine in 1948, trying to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state, took over the West Bank.
Is it invading?
What?
Did you use the word invading?
Yes. It did cross the river, as you know, Jordan River, in order to prevent the implementation of the UN resolution partition resolution of 1947, and took over the West Bank. However, taking over the West Bank, it didn't establish a Palestinian state separate, but it annexed this West Bank to the Hashemi kingdom. Now, the mayors, the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have their own leaders. There is still the Jordanian, they were elected on the basis of the Jordanian law with one significant change. Israel democratized the system, giving universal franchise. Beforehand, only a small minority, a small elite, was able to participate in the process of election. This, of course, was very helpful to the PLO, frankly, because the PLO was able, the first time, to mobilize mass support, and several of the mayors in the West Bank support the goals of the PLO in public, as I mentioned before. They give interviews, even on Israeli television and Israeli radio, with impunity, supporting the goals, but disassociating themselves, or at least formally disassociating themselves from the terror and from the policy, from the commitment to a policy aimed at destruction of the state of Israel, aiming at the destruction of the state of Israel. Now, I'm sure that, I have no reason to doubt it, or to doubt that they do want, or they would like to have a Palestinian state, and to perhaps, as I said before, to have a Palestinian state instead of Israel, at the expense of Israel. However, they have learned to work within the system of government in Israel, even using the Israeli courts. So I believe that these Palestinian leaders will cooperate in the practical implementation of the autonomy while avoiding formal participation in the autonomy talks. there was another case, an interesting case. When Israel took over, occupied the Gaza Strip, it prepared a plan to resettle the refugees, the Palestinians dwelling in the refugee camps. Of course, the Arab states rushed to the UN and even were able to ascertain a condemnation against this plan. Israel backed down, but afterwards established an alternative plan, a gradual plan, quietly resettling, actually helping the people in these camps to resettle themselves. The leaders were still on record against it, but the dwellers of these refugee camps were very happy to cooperate and to get out of them and to build new homes. Not to all of them, some of them. There is still a problem, but to some of them. Well, we can learn something from this case. You know, again, they want a Palestinian state, no question. They want a Palestinian state all over Israel, perhaps. But if the Israeli government terminates the military control, removes its officers that supervise the civilian government, why should they object? I have a good reason to believe that they wouldn't object. They will cooperate. It isn't what they want exactly, but it is a transitional solution to a very complex problem. And so therefore, I am not pessimistic on this score. But I do watch very carefully and try to find an answer to the question that I mentioned before, that I raised before, whether Egypt would be prepared to sign another agreement on the question of the autonomy despite the reaction in the Arab world. Now, a final word on Jordan. Jordan is in a very touchy situation, and it is facing a dilemma. Actually, there are two views, two interpretations of the Jordanian policy. There is even a speculation that the Jordanian royal family is divided, that one part of this family wants to regain control over the West Bank, while the other one doesn't want, actually is afraid of it. I'll just finish this sentence, is actually afraid of it. In the meantime, Jordan has adopted what we may term as a negative policy, as a mere negative policy, against the autonomy, against the peace treaty, buying time without establishing any positive policy. And for a very good reason, because Jordan is afraid of an independent Palestinian state today as much as Israel. I mean, perhaps even more so. Because an independent Palestinian state will invariably become, under present conditions, a PLO state. A PLO state may even consider, actually is considering, Jordan as part of Palestine. Jordan having a majority of Palestinians. They remembered what the PLO relate to as Black September in 1970. The clash, the armed clash, the armed conflict in Amman in September 1970. This PLO state may establish close ties with the Soviet Union. Next day, it may have Cubans, East Germans, and after Afghanistan, who knows, perhaps Russians there. So Jordan has a good reason not to support or not to promote this possibility. However, it enjoys today a legitimacy, an unprecedented legitimacy in the history of Jordan. It's interesting that when Jordan annexed the West Bank only two countries, two states recognized it, Great Britain and Pakistan. Even the Arab world didn't recognize it. And of course, later on, Jordan was isolated in many ways in the Arab world. Today, because of this flirt with the rejectionist front, with Syria, opposing the peace treaty, it enjoys an unprecedented legitimacy. They are going even to host a summit conference, an Arab summit conference in Amman, which wasn't possible before. So Jordan has a good reason to buy time, to wait before formulating a new positive policy. And that's why the United States was disappointed, Egypt was disappointed when Jordan didn't join the talks. And that's what, and this is the reason why Egypt was left actually only with Israel and the United States in the autonomy talks. Okay, I think I should stop now and perhaps respond to questions from, yes.